It was discovered in a box that smelled faintly of cedar and paper ash, the kind of scent that only time can make. The box had been tucked behind hymnals in the attic of an abandoned church in Ohio, its edges darkened by dust and years of rain that had found their way through the roof. Inside were a handful of forgotten records, a rusted key, and a single photograph wrapped in linen. No one could remember how long it had been there, or who might have placed it beneath the rafters where the doves nested, but the photo was still whole. Its surface, though cracked at the corners, held onto light as if it had never truly faded. The image showed a church picnic, one of those small gatherings that seem to exist in every town, in every summer between wars. The year written faintly on the back was 1912, and the hand that had written it was elegant, deliberate, Ohio church picnic, under the oaks. The letters were thin, confident, like someone who didn't expect to be forgotten. Yet the photograph itself told a quieter story. At first glance, it seemed harmless, idyllic even. The long table stretched beneath the canopy of trees, dappled sunlight glinting across the dishes, laughter frozen midair. Men wore rolled sleeves and straw hats. Women wore pressed cotton dresses, pale as morning. Their faces were turned not toward the camera but toward one another, caught between conversation and ritual. It was a perfect frame of an unremarkable day, but the longer one looked, the more it resisted simplicity. The photograph held too much stillness for what should have been motion. The oak leaves above did not blur. The children in the background, though mid-laughter, were too sharply defined, their joy trapped in the amber light of the lens. And then there was the table, that long, solemn altar of ordinary life. Near its center, just beside the old minister with the crooked bow tie, there sat a woman of perhaps 30. Her hands were folded around a pitcher of lemonade, her eyes fixed on something outside the frame. Her name, written faintly on the back in another hand, read Ella May, but on the table before her, a place card lay half-tucked under a plate. The visible name was hers. Yet beneath the graphite, in the right angle of light, there was another, fainter, ghost-like, scratched beneath the surface. Isaac. It wasn't ink. It wasn't pencil. It was something older, perhaps a mark made by the nib of a pen pressed too hard into the paper, or perhaps something carved into the card long before it bore her name. Whatever it was, it pulsed with its own quiet gravity, as though the card itself remembered something no one else could. The historian who found the photograph turned it over again and again in the light, searching for explanation. She brushed the edges gently, expecting nothing more than age or accident. But the deeper she looked, the more the world in the picture began to move, not literally, but within her imagination. She could almost hear the cicadas in the trees, the clinking of glass, the slow, distant murmur of hymn tunes drifting from the church hall behind the grove. It felt less like looking at a photograph and more like being looked at by it. There was something about the composition itself, too careful for chance. The photographer had stood far enough to include everyone, yet close enough to give weight to the details, the reflection of the picture, the shadow under the table, the faint breeze caught in Ella May's hair. Whoever took the picture understood more than exposure and focus. They understood silence. The historian studied the image late into the night, scanning it, enlarging it, tracing the names on the back. There were many, but only one that stood out. Next to Ella May was a faint note in parentheses, sister of Isaac, deceased. The handwriting trembled slightly there, as if written by someone unsure whether the word deceased still applied. And yet on the place card before her, the name Isaac had not been erased. It had only been hidden. The light in the attic flickered once, perhaps just the wind disturbing the wire. But for a brief moment, the photograph seemed to shift. The reflection on the picture turned brighter, almost like sunlight glancing off metal. The historian leaned closer. Inside the faint gleam, there appeared to be the outline of a hand. Not the woman's, not anyone's at the table. A man's hand resting on the linen beside her cup, visible only in the glass reflection, invisible in the world of the picnic itself. When she blinked, it was gone. The next morning she brought the photo to her desk downstairs. The church records were scattered across it. Marriage certificates, baptismal lists, funeral notices. The year 1912 came alive again in the ink and the names. There were 8 entries under Isaac, most of them boys from nearby farms. But one record stood out. Isaac May, missing, presumed drowned, June 30th, 1911. She whispered the name under her breath. It matched the one on the card. The picnic had taken place in late July, less than a month after his disappearance. Perhaps the card had been reused. Perhaps it had been left over from the funeral, hastily repurposed for a summer lunch. There were 100 possible explanations. Yet the way the card sat, deliberate, half-hidden, perfectly aligned with the light, felt intentional, like a message left between the living and the gone. She held the photo again, her fingertips tracing the curve of the card, and there, in the grain of the paper, she saw something she had missed before. Faint lines etched across the surface, so shallow they only caught light at certain angles. When tilted, they formed letters. He was here. The words weren't written so much as embedded, part of the texture itself. Outside, a storm gathered over the fields. The windows of the archive trembled, and the smell of ozone filled the air. She turned the photograph once more, and for a moment, she thought she saw motion. The soft sway of the oak branches, the faint shimmer of sunlight on glass. The past was breathing. It wasn't until she looked closer at the shadow cast by the minister's arm that she saw it. Another outline, faint, blurred, as though someone had stood there once but been erased by time. A figure without form. And for the first time she felt it, the pull of something unfinished. The photograph had not been taken to remember a day of joy. It had been taken so someone, perhaps Ella May herself, would never forget a name. That night, she pinned the photo to the wall above her desk. She left the lamp burning low, its light steady against the sepia world. The oak leaves, the dresses, the solemn faces, all stood frozen in their century-old stillness. Yet in the quiet hum of the archive, she could almost hear the echo of a man's voice, low and steady, reciting grace before a meal long turned to dust. And when she finally turned away to leave, she could swear she saw something new. A faint shimmer at the end of the table. A cup, once empty, now half full. Before the photograph, before the paper card that carried two names, there had been a sound. A single bell echoing across the hills of rural Ohio. It was the church bell of St. Andrew's, small and unassuming, its tone bright and thin against the morning haze. Every Sunday it called the town together, its ringing folding over wheat fields and orchards until even the farthest farms seemed to listen. That bell had marked births and deaths, weddings and floods, the steady rhythm of time in a town too small for secrets. But in the summer of 1912, its tolling was softer, hesitant, as though the bell itself mourned something it could not name. Ella May heard it from her porch that morning, her hands deep in a basin of cold water. The light of June slipped through the lace curtain, turning the suds into silver foam. Her dress sleeves were rolled, her hair pinned in a way that looked temporary, as though she hadn't intended to stay long in her own skin. On the table beside her sat a letter folded 3 times, yellow at the edges, its ink bleeding where rain had touched it. It had been found months earlier on the bank of the river where her brother Isaac May was last seen. The letter was addressed to no one. It began with 4 words, "I'll meet you there." There was no signature, only the faint imprint of something circular, the bottom of a glass perhaps, or a ring pressed too long against the page. Ella never showed the letter to anyone. She kept it inside her Bible, under a pressed violet that had long lost its color. She told the others she had made peace with what happened, that the current was strong that year, that boys went missing, that grief fades if you stay busy. But every night, when the oil lamp burned low, she would take the letter out again and trace the indentations with her thumb until she could almost feel his voice. The townspeople loved to speak of the May family in past tense. The father, a mill worker who had died of fever. The mother, who sewed dresses for the minister's wife until her eyes gave out. The twins, Ella and Isaac, who had shared everything, even silence. He had been quieter, slower to speak, but sharp in ways that unsettled the older men. He built small machines from scrap wire and clock parts, claiming he could hear the world hum if he held his breath. Some said he was touched by something divine. Others whispered that he saw things not meant for sight. When he drowned, it was said to have happened at dusk. The river that ran past the church was calm that evening, smooth as polished glass. He'd gone to retrieve a fishing line tangled under the bridge and never returned. No one saw him fall. No one saw him resurface. The search went on for days. The water gave back his hat, his shoes, and finally, 3 days later, a single glove caught in a drift of reeds. The minister called it a tragedy. The undertaker called it fate, but Ella called it unfinished. The picnic had been the church's way of lifting the fog. "Bring what you have," the minister said, "and we'll make the rest together." People came from neighboring farms carrying baskets of bread, smoked ham, preserves, pies that smelled of cinnamon and dust. They laughed because it was expected. They prayed because they didn't know what else to do. Ella arrived late, walking down the dirt path in her Sunday white, a dress she hadn't worn since before the river took him. The wind pushed against the hem, stirring the faint scent of lavender she'd used to wash it. She carried a wicker basket and a folded card she had written that morning. The name she intended to write on it was her own, but when she pressed the graphite to paper, her hand trembled. The pencil left 2 faint strokes before the tip broke. She stared at the half-formed letter, and for reasons she couldn't explain, wrote Isaac instead. When she reached the table, the minister greeted her softly. He placed her near the middle, beside the pitcher of lemonade and the hymn book that lay open to "Shall We Gather at the River." She smiled politely, placed the basket down, and slipped the folded card beneath a plate. The moment she did, a breeze swept through the clearing, stirring the linen, knocking over a napkin and setting the oak leaves to whisper. Several people turned their heads. The minister looked upward as though waiting for rain. But it didn't rain. The air simply changed, cooler, as though the light had shifted. Throughout the afternoon, she spoke to no one. The laughter around her seemed distant, tinny, like echoes through an old phonograph. Her thoughts drifted to the river, to the letter, to the sound of the bell that morning. Each voice at the table blurred into another until she could no longer tell who was speaking. Then, without warning, she felt it, a touch against her wrist. Gentle, brief, cold. She looked down. No one stood beside her. The space to her left was empty save for the lemonade pitcher, half full, its glass shimmering with light. Within its reflection, she thought she saw the outline of a hand resting beside her cup. When she blinked, it was gone. The rest of the day unfolded like a dream stitched from habit. Children played, hymns drifted. The sun dipped low enough to turn every plate and cup into a small mirror. But when the camera appeared, something in the air tightened. The photographer, a traveling man from Cincinnati, had been invited to take portraits of the congregation. He was a thin figure with ink on his cuffs, his hair slicked to one side. He spoke little, preferring to direct with hand gestures. When he positioned the table under the oaks, he asked them not to move. "Hold still," he said. "Hold your breath if you must." And they did. The shutter clicked, the light flashed, and time itself folded into glass. No one noticed until later that Ella May's shadow fell in two directions. One cast behind her, soft and narrow under the trees. The other stretched faintly toward the left, darker, thicker, ending where no person sat. When the photograph was developed a week later, that shadow remained. The minister said it was a trick of the lens. The photographer insisted it wasn't. He had seen many exposures, many faults, but never one that looked like presence. And on the table just beneath the plate, the name card appeared twice. Once, clearly marked Ella May, and again, faintly below it, the word Isaac, pressed into the grain like memory refusing to die. Years later, that photograph would be found again in a box of church ledgers, the same one where the bell's cracked clapper lay forgotten. But before that, it hung briefly in the parish hall, pinned by a nail to a corkboard. Every week someone would glance at it in passing, perhaps during a bake sale or sermon. No one ever spoke about the extra shadow, yet those who stood before it long enough said they always felt the same thing, the smell of river water, and the faint ringing of a bell. It was nearly 70 years after the picnic when the photograph resurfaced. By then, the church had long since closed its doors. The oak trees were gone, cut down for lumber during the Depression, and the land where the table once stood had turned to pale weeds and wild clover. Only the photograph remained, sealed in a manila envelope stamped, "Archival, do not discard." It came into the hands of a woman named Margaret Ellison, a curator at the Ohio Historical Society, whose work was to restore what the past had tried to forget. Margaret was a quiet woman, not sentimental, not easily moved by ghosts. Her desk was a geography of fragments, pressed flowers from century-old diaries, ink-stained ledgers, brittle hymn sheets that fell apart when touched. She believed in preservation, not resurrection. Yet when she lifted that photograph from its envelope, the air in her office seemed to change temperature. It was not the usual chill of old paper. It was something else, something that hummed beneath the surface like the slow vibration of a cello string still resonating long after the bough has passed. The image, faded but intact, showed the long table beneath the trees. Every face was visible, each expression still caught between solemnity and sunlit stillness. Margaret leaned closer, her magnifying glass trembling slightly in her hand. There, the faint inscription on the card. She had seen hundreds of old name cards before, but this one was different. Two names occupied the same space, one written boldly, one rising faintly from beneath, like a shadow underwater. Ella May, and beneath it, barely perceptible, Isaac. At first she thought it was a bleed-through from the reverse side, but the back was blank. She turned the glass again, adjusting for glare. The letters were not drawn in ink. They were pressed into the fibers, as if someone had carved them from within. She lifted her eyes to the woman seated at the table, Ella May. There was something in her expression that unsettled Margaret, a tension between peace and waiting. Her hands were clasped near the pitcher of lemonade, yet her eyes, though soft, seemed to rest somewhere beyond the frame, as if she were listening. Behind her, the sunlight struck the rim of a glass, and within its reflection, almost invisible, was what looked like another hand, faint and masculine, reaching toward hers. Margaret adjusted the lens again, her heart thudding softly. No, she told herself. Reflection, exposure, artifact, nothing more. But the feeling wouldn't leave. She began to cross-reference the names in church records. There it was, Isaac May, drowned in 1911, body never recovered. And 1 year later, a record of a memorial gathering and community picnic hosted by Reverend John Kellis. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "The May family attended, though with heavy hearts." Ella brought lemonade and sat near the minister. Margaret exhaled slowly. It was a trivial detail, one that should have meant nothing. Yet the precision of it, the same lemonade, the same place, the same day, anchored the photograph in something painfully real. She wrote a note to herself. Re-photograph under alternate light. Investigate card inscription. That evening, as the museum closed and rain whispered against the windows, she prepared the UV lamp. Old photographs often revealed more under ultraviolet. Maker's marks, chemical stains, invisible ink. She dimmed the main lights, turned on the lamp, and lowered the glass cover over the photo. At first, nothing. Then, slowly, faint lines began to emerge across the bottom edge. A second handwriting, smaller, rushed. It had been written in invisible ink, likely lemon juice, the kind sometimes used for labeling by amateur photographers. Margaret leaned closer. The words glowed softly under the violet light. "Take this grace in my name." The phrase was simple, but its meaning struck her with quiet force. She turned off the lamp, and the words vanished again, leaving only the sepia silence. Over the next days, she became obsessed. She cataloged the chemical composition of the paper, the ratio of silver to nitrate in the emulsion, even the curvature of the brush marks from the photo's development. Each test returned ordinary results. Nothing unnatural, nothing forged. And yet, each time she looked at it, she felt watched. Not in the sinister sense, not by malice or haunt, but by presence. Like the moment in a church when the hymn ends and everyone holds their breath before the next verse. It wasn't until the fifth night that she noticed the change. The photograph had been scanned earlier that week. When she opened the digital file, the copy looked identical, except for one detail. The name card was now blank. No Ella, no Isaac, just a faint indentation, as if the names had withdrawn into the paper. She reopened the physical photograph. The names were still there, but when she turned it slightly toward the lamplight, she saw something else reflected in the glossy surface. The room behind her, desk, window, lamp, all perfectly mirrored, except one detail. There was someone standing behind her chair. She froze, the air thick as water. Her pulse roared in her ears. She turned. Nothing. Only the steady hum of the fluorescent lights above. When she looked back down, the reflection was gone. But a drop of water, impossibly, in a sealed, air-conditioned room, had appeared on the surface of the photograph, right above the card. It rolled downward slowly, leaving a clean trail across a century of dust. She caught it with her fingertip. It was cold, salty, like a tear. The next morning, she arrived early, determined to finish the restoration and lock the photograph away. But when she entered her office, she found the photograph no longer on her desk. It was pinned to the bulletin board across the room, the same board where the staff often left notes or schedules. It hung there with a single brass tack through its corner, perfectly level, and beneath it, written on a small piece of archival paper in neat, unfamiliar handwriting, "He was here." Margaret stood motionless. She hadn't written that note. None of her assistants had access after hours. Her eyes returned to the photo. The reflection in the picture now looked different, clearer. The hand was no longer a blur. It was reaching, palm open, fingers brushing the edge of the tablecloth. And beside it, faint but visible, a small folded card that hadn't been there before. The words on it read, "Thank you for keeping my name." She stared until the letters blurred. Then she sat, trembling, whispering the only word that felt right, "Grace." That night, long after she left, the security camera caught the image of the photo falling gently from the board, not pushed, not pulled, just sliding downward, as if released by gravity itself. When the janitor found it the next morning, it lay face down. On its reverse side, where there had been nothing before, a new line of faint pencil appeared. 6 words, written in old-fashioned cursive. "Tell her I kept the promise." For weeks, Margaret avoided the photograph. She kept it sealed in a drawer, beneath folders and letters and layers of silence. But the thought of it pressed against her mind like an afterimage left by lightning, something too bright to forget, too sacred to speak aloud. When she finally opened the drawer again, she found that the photograph no longer looked the same. Not changed, not damaged, but aged differently, as though time had moved inside it while she wasn't watching. The edges had curled inward, the sepia deepened into gold, and what had once been faint now glowed with quiet confidence. The table beneath the oak seemed sharper, the fabric more defined, and where the card had sat before, there was now a shadow shaped like an open hand. Margaret's throat tightened. She switched off the lamp and sat back, letting the room fill with twilight. The air was heavy with that particular stillness that belongs to church halls and old libraries, the kind of silence that remembers prayer. Outside it began to rain, a fine, persistent drizzle that tapped against the glass like fingertips. She closed her eyes, and somewhere between waking and remembering she saw it. The same table, the same trees, the same faces, only this time she was inside the photograph. The light was softer there. It had the warmth of summer that hadn't yet discovered loss. She stood beneath the oaks, the smell of grass and bread thick in the air. The sound of laughter drifted nearby, mingled with the gentle hum of cicadas. She looked down and saw her hands, young, unfamiliar, holding the pitcher of lemonade. When she looked up, Ella May sat across from her. The resemblance was uncanny, not identical, but mirrored. The same calm beneath the eyes, the same tremor at the corners of the mouth, the same sadness that didn't belong to a single lifetime. Ella smiled faintly, as though she had been waiting. "You found it," she said. Her voice was soft, shaped like breath. "He was always here. I just needed someone to see him." Margaret tried to speak, but no words came. The air shimmered, and through the shimmer came another figure, the faint silhouette of a boy, no older than 16, standing a few steps away from the table. His face was quiet, his hair still damp as if from a river. He didn't speak, but the look in his eyes held every word that had ever been left unsaid. Ella turned to him and smiled through tears. "I told you," she whispered. "One day, they'd say your name again." The boy nodded once solemnly and placed his hand on the table. Where it touched, the wood brightened, not with fire, but with a soft illumination like moonlight under water. The light spread slowly, tracing the lines of the tablecloth, catching on the pitcher, spilling over every forgotten plate. It reached the card and made both names visible again. Ella May and Isaac, written side by side, equal in grace. Margaret watched as the light climbed the air, twisting gently like incense. The faces around the table turned toward it, not startled, not afraid, only reverent. Then, one by one, they began to fade, their outlines softening into the brightness, until only the table and the oaks remained. Even the sound of the cicadas grew distant, replaced by something like the echo of bells, far and thin, tolling across eternity. When Margaret woke, her desk lamp was still on. The photograph lay before her, unchanged, or nearly so. The name card was blank again, but the faint reflection in the glass showed something new. Her own face, and behind her, two figures blurred in the soft gold of the image. They stood together under the oaks, a woman and a young man, side by side. For a moment, she thought she was dreaming still, but the warmth on her palm was real. She looked down. Resting there was a pressed violet, brittle, colorless, yet perfectly preserved. She remembered the note, "Take this grace in my name." It was not a message. It was an invitation. Margaret placed the flower between the photograph and a clean sheet of glass, sealing them together. The violet crumbled slightly under pressure, leaving behind a faint ring of dust that looked almost like light. The next week, she delivered the photograph to the museum's collection vault, labeling it simply, "Church Picnic, Ohio, 1912, donated anonymously." No explanation, no mystery, just a date, a place, a name that had finally been given back to time. Yet as she filed the accession card, she hesitated. For the first time, she wrote both names, Ella May and Isaac May. Then beneath them, one more word, a curator's note that wasn't procedure, but truth. Reunited. That night, a storm swept through Columbus. Lightning flashed across the museum's tall windows, illuminating the archive room for only seconds at a time. A guard on patrol paused near the photography section, startled by what he saw through the glass. Inside the darkened room, the single photograph glowed faintly, like a candle behind frosted glass. And though he couldn't hear it clearly, he swore there was music, a hymn, old and slow, drifting from nowhere and everywhere at once. When he leaned closer, the light faded, leaving only the reflection of his own face. But later, when he checked the footage, he saw what the human eye could not. For precisely 30 seconds, two additional figures appeared in the reflection, seated at a table beneath unseen trees. Weeks later, when Margaret returned to check on the storage, she noticed something she couldn't explain. The photo, sealed under glass, had changed again. The background, once a blur of distant trees, now showed faint beams of sunlight filtering through leaves, as though the oaks had come alive once more. And just visible in the far right corner, on the edge of the table, was a folded card that hadn't been there before. It bore 3 words written in perfect pencil strokes, "The grace kept." Margaret smiled, not in disbelief, but in recognition. For the first time in her life, she understood the weight of silence, not as emptiness, but as continuation. She turned off the light, leaving the photo to its own stillness. Outside, the sky cleared, and for a brief, impossible moment. The dawn light through the high windows looked exactly like the filtered gold beneath the oaks in 1912. In the years that followed, the photograph would appear in small exhibits, often unnoticed, often mislabeled, but those who lingered before it always said the same thing. The light seemed alive, and somewhere between the laughter and the shadows, it felt as though someone were still saying grace. No one knows exactly when the photograph stopped belonging to the museum. Some say it was misplaced during renovations. Others claim it was intentionally removed, sealed away by a curator who feared that history was starting to breathe again. Whatever the reason, by the time they checked the archives in the spring of 1984, the image was gone. Only its absence remained, a faint outline of dust where the frame had once hung, a rectangular patch lighter than the wall around it. But the file label was still there, typed on thin paper. Ohio Church Picnic 1912, Ella May and Isaac May, and beneath that, in handwriting unfamiliar to any staff, 3 more words: the grace kept. The museum director dismissed it as error. The file was closed, the shelf recatalogued, and with time, like all stories, it began to fade. Until 30 years later, when the photograph surfaced again, not in a gallery, not in an archive, but in the hands of a woman named Claire Hollis, who had purchased a box of antique prints from an estate sale near Dayton. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that smelled faintly of lavender, she found the same image: the long table, the oak leaves, the solemn faces, frozen in eternal summer. She didn't know its history. She only knew that it made her quiet. Claire was a school teacher, the kind who collected old objects for her classroom. She believed children learned best through stories, the kind of stories that still carried fingerprints. When she first showed the photograph to her students, they pointed out the usual details: the clothes, the picture, the shadows. But one child, a quiet boy named Andrew, raised his hand and said something that made her stop. "He's looking at her," he whispered. "Who is?" Claire asked, smiling. "The boy under the trees," Andrew replied. "He's looking at the lady with the drink. She doesn't see him, but he's there." Claire looked closely. There was no boy, only dappled sunlight and soft contrast where the tree shadows thickened. Still, the certainty in the child's voice left her uneasy. That night, after the classroom emptied, she set the photograph on her desk beneath a reading lamp. The light revealed every wrinkle, every smudge, every grain of age. And there, faintly, she saw it too. A shape she hadn't noticed before. A figure between the oaks, barely visible, but there. The next morning, she brought it to the local library. The archivist scanned it at high resolution, adjusting brightness and contrast until the shadows unfolded like layers of time. In the space between the branches, the figure became clearer, the outline of a young man half smiling, head tilted slightly toward the woman at the table. "Could be a trick of exposure," the archivist murmured. Claire nodded, but her heart was not convinced. She asked for a print. When it was ready, she held it up to the window, letting sunlight fall through it. For the briefest moment, the air in the room felt warmer. And though she would never say so aloud, she thought she heard something, a faint distant hum like the echo of church bells carried on the wind. Weeks passed. She kept the photograph on her mantle, where afternoon light struck it just so. Sometimes when she walked by, she thought she could see the faint glimmer of motion, a ripple of brightness moving across the tablecloth, as though wind had found its way into the image itself. She told herself it was imagination. But imagination, when old enough, becomes memory. One evening in late September, she returned home to find the photograph tilted slightly forward, as though someone had touched it. Behind the frame's glass, something new had appeared, the faintest reflection of handwriting, not on the surface but within the emulsion itself. She tilted it toward the light and read the words, written as if from the other side: "Say grace." Her breath caught. It wasn't a command, it was an invitation. She whispered the old prayer she remembered from childhood, a simple one her grandmother used to say before meals. "For what we've been given, for what remains unseen, for what has passed through us and stayed behind, we give thanks." As she spoke, the glass fogged slightly, though the room was cold. When it cleared, the reflection was gone. But the photo seemed warmer now, its colors deeper, its silence softer. Years later, when Claire grew older and retired, she donated her small collection of photographs to the county library. Most were anonymous portraits, forgotten faces with no stories left to tell. But one photograph, she said, needed no label. "It already knows who it is," she told the librarian. The woman smiled politely and placed it on a shelf to be catalogued later. But when the library reopened the next morning, the photograph had been moved. It now hung above the reading table, perfectly centered, leveled, lit by sunlight streaming through the tall windows. No one knew who placed it there. No one questioned it. It simply looked right, and those who sat beneath it sometimes reported the same thing: a faint sound of leaves rustling, the smell of lemonade, and the strange, comforting sense that someone, somewhere, was remembering them back. Today, the photograph exists in more than one place. It appears in small-town museums, on forgotten websites, in family albums of people who swear they never bought it. Each copy slightly different. The light changes, the faces shift, the handwriting at the bottom sometimes clear, sometimes gone, but the table is always there. The oaks are always there, and between them, the quiet grace of a name that refuses to vanish. If you hold the image under bright light, just the right kind of sunlight, not the harsh modern kind, but the warm afternoon hue of a long summer's end, you might see it too. A hand resting gently on the table, two names written faintly on a card, and the echo of laughter that once belonged to a brother and a sister, bound not by blood, but by remembrance. If you listen closely enough, you might even hear the faint toll of a bell, ringing from a century away. It doesn't call for prayer, it calls for memory, and maybe that's all any of us ever leave behind, the quiet sound of our name, still waiting to be spoken by someone who hasn't yet forgotten how. Subscribe to Veilside Stories, because every photograph has an echo, and somewhere inside it, time is still breathing.